זה בדיוק על החיטה של היום. התחלת החיטה של היום זה הפסוק הזה. על הפסק כל גודל ולא יוסף, כתוב מה הפירוש כל גודל ולא יוסף. בחיטה של אתמול למדנו על 10 הדיברס. שהכל של 10 הדיברס לא פסק. אז מה הפירוש של לא פסק? מביא המדרש 3 פירושים. א', כל אחד נחלק לזין קולויס, והם נחלקים לעין לשון, שלא נשאר רק בלשון הקודש. Even though the Aser Sadibris were said in Lashon HaKodesh, but then that voice was divided into 7, and from that it went out into the 70 languages of the 70 nations. That's what it means, Loi Pasak. It didn't stop by one language, it went to all the languages. Beis, Shemimenu nisnabu kol hanevim she'amdu. That coil by Matan Torah went further into all the Nevi'im and all the other generations. HaKoil loy nodam? Loy nadam?
Nadam, be quiet.
Quiet. Be'ez ma'ase, ki im nimshach tamid, keloymar, shema HaKoil shal Matan Torah mishtal shlim kol ha'inyonim shenizgalu achar kach ha'idei Nevi'im, and not just the Nevi'im, but also v'chachamim shebechol doir v'doir. Like the Rebbe brings in a footnote, that this is also the Chachamim are a continuation of the Koil of Matan Torah. They are still speaking the words of Matan Torah in their teachings, as we can explain later on in the Sikha what that means. Gimel, the final thing is, on third Pirush that the Medrash says, Shaloi Hoyoloi Baskoil. Head. Echo. Tzarich lahavin b'meh mevate ha'pirush ha'shlishi shloyo lebaskoil es hagadlus v'abli gvul shal ha'koil ba'aseres ha'dibris. Lefi shnei ha'pirush marashayim muvan. Ha'koil lahoya mugbal lashon hakodesh belvad, oil lezman matan Torah belvad. In other words, this is how built-in mugbal the koil was. It wasn't just limited to one sound, it wasn't just limited to one language, or it wasn't just limited to one time. It was forever and in all languages. Elashi yarad v'yispashtet l'chol al shoynis v'nimshach v'chol adoyres. Aval zeh shaloi hoy lebaskoil ein amoyra l'chura al chayzik hakoil. We're trying to explain about the greatness of the sound of Matan Torah. Koil gadol v'lo yosef. How great, how gadol was the koil? It didn't stop. It didn't have an echo. How does that show that was a koil gadol? What does that have to do with a koil gadol? And the Rebbe says just the opposite. Adrabe, kechol she'akoil mischazik, kach gadol gam oitzmas ha'hed. How do you pronounce it? Head. U'ma'achar she'koil zeh lo yoy head, harei ze moira l'choyr al chalishusik. Just the opposite. It's not a koil gadol. The louder you speak, like you hear me now, I'm speaking loud, you hear an echo over here. If I would be speaking quietly, there wouldn't be an echo. So when you say that Hashem's koil gadol, lo yosef, there was no echo, that doesn't seem to say anything about how great the voice of the Eibishter was. Adrab, it seems to say that Hashem's voice was not that great. So what's the koil gadol of lo yosef? The Rebbe brings in footnote 3 a very lishmaka thing. Why not? Why does Hashem do nisim for no reason? He says, because the Ran says that Hashem set up the rules of nature and He wants that the world should run by the rules of the Teva, by Chukei HaTeva. He doesn't want it to leave the rules of nature. There are exceptions, and those exceptions are for a purpose. When there's a reason for the rules of nature to be broken, let's say you take the Yidden out of Mitzrayim to give them food in the Midbar, fine, he'll break the rules of nature. But just, Hashem is not a show-off, just to show himself off, he's not going to break the rules of nature. L'loy tzorich, u'ma'achar sh'l'kol koil kaim b'teva baskoil, u'l'koil gadol yesh heid chazak, l'shem ma'ir tzorich li'is kan shini ha'teva sh'l'koil ha'gadol sh'matan Torah lo yehed. What's the big, why perform a miracle for no reason? יש מפורש מהמבארים שההכרח בנס זהו כדי שלא תהיה נסינס מוקם לטויס ולחשב שההד הוא כל אחר. If you hear an echo, you might think that maybe it's not Hashem speaking. So therefore Hashem made a nest. There shouldn't be an echo. So therefore you'll know that it's only Hashem talking. That's some Mefarshim explaining. But the Rebbe says that you wouldn't come, why would you even come to think that way? Ach ein pirish amoven shekem bebasker la nicker she heid khoizer shal kol atzmai banish ma oise kol voice not tavis. So therefore, who would make such a mistake? If you hear an echo, again, right now when I'm speaking, you're hearing an echo. Do you have any doubt and thinking, no, that's not my voice? You can hear it's coming immediately after I spoke. It's saying the exact same things with the exact same sound, like what I said. It's obviously coming from me. So he's saying, V'im kishak kol Matan Torah ba medal druch sa'are ha'ilom shemaim v'aretz mekol ha'beruchis. Boizmanis, at one time, the very same moment, the coil of Matan Torah came from all directions. So therefore, if you heard such a miraculous thing, that all sides of the world, you were surrounded by the voice of Hashem, you can be worried. Oh, 1 second, this echo is something else. גם צריך להבין, התורה אינו מספר סיפורים סתם, כי אם כדי ללמד מהם היראה בעבודתנו. איזה היראה בעבודת תמונה בסיפור של מתן תורה כל גדול ולא יוסף. In other words, it could be, maybe you could find an answer why at that time it was necessary for Hashem's voice not to have an echo. But the fact that the Torah records it for us is not just for informational purposes, not just for historical purposes, but everything that's in the Torah is in the word Hayrah. It's a lesson. It must teach us something about our avodas Hashem. So that's what the question, what does this help us in our avodas Hashem to know that it was Kol Gadol V'lo Yosef in general, all these three things, and especially this idea that there was no echo. Base. So the question is, why use a strange word like that, Anochi? Most of the times in the Torah, when it uses the word for I, it says Ani. So the Gemara says that Anochi, there's a special reason for saying Anochi. It has a Rosh Tevis. HaGemara imeres al kach, she'anochi hu Rosh Tevis anon nafshis ksavis yavis. I wrote myself and gave myself over in Torah. Keloimar she'matan Torah atzmusi yizborech kiviyachol. Hichti v'nosnas atzmei besoich aseres hadibris she'amar oz. V'hu amar zois l'chol echad mebnei Yisrael benifrad anochi havai Elokecha lashon yachid. The Chazal explain why did Hashem speak in singular, Elokecha, not Elokechem, to tell us that Hashem was speaking to each one of us individually. And not just individually, to every single Yid then, V'loi rak b'bnei Yisrael shebedoirahu ki im k'fi sherazal oimrim sheb'maymed har SInai noichechu kol haneshamas hein eile shayu lifnei Matan Torah v'hein hadoyres shel ha'achrov u'chol echad mehem amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Anochi Hashem Elokecha. What does it mean, Anochi havai Elokecha? V'anon nafshi ksavis Yehovis hu kiviyachol moser es atzmei b'chol atzmiyusei l'chol echad l'chud. That when Hashem spoke to Aseres HaDibros, it's something that He put Himself into it. And every Yid, Chaviyachol, can grasp Hashem through the Torah that He spoke. But it starts with Aseres HaDibros, and then we'll see, Kol Gadol V'lo Yosef, the rest of the Torah has the same power like Aseres HaDibros, that every part of the Torah we have, Anochi havai Elokecha, Hashem's very essence in the Torah that we're learning. Alulim hari lachshav sha'anon nafshik sovis yehavis hayrak v'aseres hadibros. Aval in yonei ha'Torah mitzvahs shenizgalu la'achar mekain. There was a lot of mitzvahs that Moshe Rabbeinu told them after Matan Torah. Aseres Adibris only was by Matan Torah. After Matan Torah, there was mitzvahs. Then later on, Ba'arbas Moyav, Chumash Dvarim, there was more mitzvahs. Throughout their time in Midbar Sinai, there was different times when Moshe Rabbeinu was Megal to the mitzvahs according to one day. So you might think, you know where Hashem is invested, Anon Nafshik Shabbos Yehavis, only Daser Sadibris. Not in the rest of the Torah mitzvahs. Ubefrat, and especially you'll say this, that doesn't apply. That Hashem placed His essence into it. And the Nevi'im did not make it up. They heard it from Hashem, but it's still not anon nafshik savos Yehavis. It's still not Hashem invested in it. Ein b'matoykev shematan Torah. Bohem loy namar Anochi atzmusim mahusay. Elahim bedugmas hatzivuyim shnitztavu ha'avis lefnei Matan Torah. There are other mitzvahs, for example, the mitzvahs that the Avos were given before Matan Torah that didn't have a connection with Anochi. So you might think that the mitzvahs that were revealed after Matan Torah also don't have the power of Anochi that Hashem invested Himself in those mitzvahs that say later. Shenemru lekal kuloi, that these were said to the entire klal, v'loy hayras chalechad v'chuv. It's not an individual directive to every person individually. In other words, whatever the Chachamim, the Nevi'im said, was not this individual Elokecha type of thing. Kol adam amna mechuyev l'kaimam avarak mishum sheze chelik ma'aklal v'loy shem tzivui miyuchad l'chal yachid. So you might think there's no personal relationship between me and Hashem in other parts of the Torah, in things that the Nevi'im said, in things that the Chachamim said. Klap is a namar koil God of Allah Yosef. Kol inyane ha-Torah shemizgalim b'chol doir v'doir hem adayin oisei ha-koil godel shel Matan Torah. Ha-koil shel Anochi havaya lekecha lashon yachid. She'atzmusi yisbarach poinel kol Yehudi l'chol yachid benifrad. V'lamroi she'advarim loy nizgalu ad she'hanovi v'achacham amrum. Why, if everything that any Navi and any Chacham had to say is really Anochi and Elokecha, it's really Hashem communicating to us, each one individually, so why didn't we hear it by Matan Torah? Why hear it only later, 40 years later, 100 years later, 2,000 years later when the Chachamim came up with it? So he says, there are things that were not meant to be given over, the Chazal say. A nevuah was meant to be said later on. It doesn't mean that it's any less powerful. It's just, it's meant to be revealed at a certain time, and not in the previous time. The kol inyan b'Torah yesh le'zman boy olav lizgalas ma'akol shematan Torah. Now this is a very important point that people don't realize. When the Torah was given, every part of Torah was given. It says, Kol mashe talmid vasik asid l'chadish nitna l'Moshe b'Sinai. So why wasn't it revealed yet? Because for whatever reason, Hashem decided that certain things need to be revealed in certain generations. Some things had to be related to the Doir HaMidbar. Some things had to be related in the times of Shlomo HaMelech. Some things had to be told over by the Rebbe to us. Every generation has its own time when it needs certain parts of Torah being revealed. And that's also the reason why, for example, Pnimius HaTorah was not something that was made public for everybody until the last few generations. Because Hashem decided that this part of Torah, even though it's just as valid as any other part of Torah, and it has Hashem's Anochi, and it is individually for each one of us, but it's meant to come out in a certain time. That is the meaning, that's the inner meaning of the first Medrash Pshat in Koil Gadol V'lo Yosef, that all of the different generations, the voice of the different Nevi'im and Chachamim throughout all the generations, it's an unceasing continuation of the Anochi to each individual Yid. Chachu gam b'kesher l'pirish b'Koil Gadol שהכל של מתן תורה נחלק ל7 לשון. Why was it necessary to come out to 7 לשון? בני נויח מחויבים ב7 מצוות. וישראל חייב לקוף כפייה דתית. ובזמן שאין יד ישראל תקיפה, we can't use כפייה דתית, then we have to be להשתדל only. שבני נויח יקיימו את 7 מצוות שלהם. This is what the Rambam says. We have this obligation. And this obligation is not something separate than the rest of the Torah. ובכדי שלא יחשבו ש7 מצוות שלהם הם דבר צדדי. שאין לא שייכות למתן תורה. Meres HaTorah, according to the second explanation in Kol Gadol LaYosef, שהכל שמתן תורה נחלק לעין לשון, שגם המצוות שהם עבור 7 לשון אומס העולם, מקורה מכל גדול של מתן תורה, שלכן גם קיום המצוות שלהם צריך להיות אצלם מצד הציווי שבמתן תורה. The Rebbe is soon going to bring from the Rambam that to be from the Chsidei Umas HaOlam, a guy who fulfills the Sheva Mitzvos Bnei Noach must do it because this was Moshe Rabbeinu received it in Har Sinai. Not just do it because it makes sense not to bow down to idols. It makes sense not to kill. No. That's first of all, shouldn't just be because it makes sense. El Yisayrim Mizu, Aleim Lekaimam Kikein Siva Kodesh Baruch Hu B'Toiram V'Haidiai De Moshe Rabbeinu Shal Bnei Noach Lekayim Es HaSheva Mitzvos. This is what the Rambam says, to be able to be considered from the Chsidei Umas Ha'olam. V'Yidiyah Zu Shayeches Gam LeBnei Yisrael. A Yid needs to know that a Goy has to fulfill the Sheva Mitzvos because it was commanded on Har Sinai to Moshe Rabbeinu that a Goy should fulfill the 7 mitzvahs. Why? Because Yehudi tzarech lakuf as umas ha'olam u'lishtadel etzlam, when he can't use kfiyah datit, lekayim as 7 mitzvahs mishum tzivui HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'hamayden Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom. That's how we have to influence a Goy to fulfill the 7 mitzvahs Bnei Noach. That's why it was Kol Gadol v'lo Yosef, that it had to be divided into all the 70 languages. Hayra ikris nesefes b'kol gadol goymer, he says, Nois Gimel, shenechok la'ayin loshen, yedua pirish al maimer azal, lo'higla HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael lebein ha'umas, Elokecha v'yitois v'aleim gerim. Now, if you calculate, we had, over the centuries and over the millennia, we've had quite a few gerim. But not enough. There's a few thousand Gerim, 10,000s of Gerim. Not enough to justify the 2,000 or so years of Golus. Therefore, we explained that Gerim doesn't just mean a person who was born a Goy and now becomes a Yid according to Halacha, but it means something deeper as well. Anything that's brought from a state of non-Jewishness to a state of holiness is called a ger. It's being literally converted. It's being taken from klippa and being brought into kedusha. Shegerim kan hakavana l'netzoyis hakedusha ashruyim begolus etzel umas ha'olam. V'aidei shebnei Yisrael nimtzoyim begolus v'oiskim shom ba'avodas habirurim mitvasvim gerim anetzoyis mevarim amalim oisel l'kedusha. So when I eat kosher food, and I eat it l'shem shamayim, and I use the energy to learn, I use the energy to daven, so then there is nitzoitzes of kedusha that were trapped in klippa, and they were now nisgayer. They became gerim and converted to kedusha. Now, it's not just physical objects where you have nitzoitzes of kedusha embedded that we could elevate, but even in the language that we speak. Some people say, why are we learning Torah in English or whatever? Should learn it only in Lashon Hakodesh. And historically, I believe that in the times, let's say, of the second Beis Hamikdash or so Lashon Kodesh was like reserved, at least according to some explanations. Lashon Kodesh was used only for holy matters. you davened, you learned. That's when you use Lashon Hakodesh. You went to business. You spoke about other things that were not Torah oriented, not davening oriented. Lashon Hakodesh was not spoken. You used whatever was a common language, Aramis or Yevonis or whatever it was. Ivrit, yeah. So he says, Gam yesh lefarish shegeirim hakavana lenetzoitzes hakdusha nimtzoim b'toich hashivim losh. Al dezeh shebnei Yisrael mishtamshim b'tevis shebeshivim losh. Biskeim al pi ha-Torah l'shem shamayim v'chol shken kishmishtamshim b'tevis elu b'limud ha-Torah atzma. In other words, you could use it for doing things l'shem shamayim. You're using English to go to work. But why are you working? You're working so you should be able to have money to be able to do mitzvahs, so you should be able to support your family so they can do mitzvahs, so you should be able to pay your children's tuition, so you should be able to buy a lulav nesrig and make a seder and so on. So the English that you're using to maybe even speak to a guy in your business is being elevated because your business is for a holy matter. And if it's so when you're using the English in your business, how much more so if you use your English for Torah learning? Again, usually we think the other way around. Shouldn't Torah learning be done in Lashon Hakodesh, etc., etc.? So the Rebbe is saying just the opposite. When you use your English or whatever other language for Torah, so then it comes out you're elevating, you're being megayer the netzoitzes kedusha that are there in the English language. So he's saying, so we find that they used a language that wasn't Lashon Hakodesh. Why? For the purpose of Mailemes and Tzaitzak Kedusha, Mashivim Lashon, and then Mitvasvim Aleim Geirim. Fine. So we've established that there's a great advantage and an importance to use the Shivim Lashon for Torah mitzvahs. But you might think that once you use the Torah mitzvahs for Shivim, in Shivim Lashon, you somehow watered it down. Okay, you have to, it's a good thing to use the Shivim Lashon, but maybe somehow it's less. It's not the same Torah like if you're saying it in Lashon Hakodesh. Alul meri lachshov she'haTorah nomedes b'shivim lashon ein b'kedush ha'Torah k'fi shehi b'Matan Torah. Al kach oimrim she'kol gadol zeh shel Matan Torah nechlak la'ayin lashon. Not because of the goyim that we spoke about in the previous ice, but for the yid that's learning the Torah in one of the 70 languages, it has the same full force of the Anochi and Elokecha like something you're learning in Lashon Hakodesh. Hu yarad v'yislabish b'levushim pchusim b'yoyser. Aval pnimius hakoil hu oise koil gadol shel Anochi havay Elokecha. The Rebbe says even more so. V'adraba yesh lo shoyrish amuk yoyser sharei kol gavoy b'yoyser yerd lamata mata yoyser. In a similar vein, if I remember correctly, the Rebbe says a sikha about why was it necessary for Moshe Rabbeinu to write the Torah b'shivim lashon. So one of the reasons it says is that when the Yidden go amongst the nations of the world, they'll have the Torah ready and translated for them. So the Rebbe asks, maybe Mefarshim also speak about this, why did Moshe Rabbeinu have to do it? They weren't yet going into Golus then. Whenever they would go, or be getting ready to go into Golus, then you can go ahead and translate it. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu already then have to write it b'shivim lashon? To bring home this point, the Rebbe says, that it's the same Torah as Moshe, when it's in English or Japanese or Korean, they have Korean Talmuds or whatever, as it is when it's in Lashon Hakodesh. Kol Amur who bir al shnei pirushim arishonim, that the Kol Gadol v'lo Yosef is that it goes for all Chachamim and all Nevi'im of all generations, and another is the Kol Gadol that went into all the 70 languages. Mao avala bir b'pirish ashlishi shel Kol Gadol v'lo Yosef shlo hoyle baskoil. So the Rebbe says baskoil hi bedugmas oir chayzer. It's called a rebounding or returning light. כשאור נמשך ונסקל במקום שיש בו דבר המאסטר ומניע אויסר מלהמשך הלאה, האור חייזר הוא נחסם וחייזר לאחריו. If I remember correctly, my science, my biology, that's actually the way we see. Because light bounces off the objects that we're looking at, and that light that bounces off the object is something that delivers the image of the object to our eye. If the light wouldn't bounce off this wall or your face, I wouldn't be able to see your face, I wouldn't be able to see the wall. Kach kam bebaskoil. An echo works the same way. Kasher akoil niskol bekir bedavar acher shoitzer badai hu choizer mahadheid v'hu anikra kam bemedrash baskoil. V'al derech k'moy kadur sheniter la'acher k'sheniskol bekir. Aval kol zeh betanai shahakir ayadavar hachois moy einam soifkim besoiches hakadur oyes hakoil v'ha'oyer. There are certain soundproof rooms or echo-proof rooms that people make recordings in, or they have whatever programs that they have to broadcast. It's specially made from a type of absorptive material because the material absorbs the sound and doesn't allow any type of echo and therefore feedback to come about. Now let's use this over here. What happened by Matan Torah? There was no Oyer Chayzer. There was no echo. It doesn't mean, like we said in the beginning, no echo, that means the voice was very weak. No. Hamiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu Anochi Elokecha Hoisa B'Koil Gadol Shum Davar Lo Haya Yachal Latzer B'Ad HaKoil Hu Chodar B'Kol HaOlam Games HaDoimim Kol davar safag l'soiche v'niach chadur b'koil shel Anochi. Ki b'Matan Torah hoya k'moy b'gilui de la'asid when Moshiach is going to come. K'sheyiyah v'nigla k'vay davaya v'ro kol basar. Shegilui k'vay davaya yachder v'yikolit afilu v'basar agashmi. Nothing can stand in the way of Hashem's revelation. V'lechein, you were asking, why does Hashem make an unnecessary miracle? It wasn't a miracle. It was a natural phenomenon. Because Hashem permeated everything. Very simple thing. If you're standing out in a field and there's no, mountains or anything, just a flat field like in Matan or whatever, no trees, no nothing, you're going to talk as loud as you want. There's nothing that the voice can bounce off of, so there's not going to be a baskel. Be'emes gam atu kein. Adam loimed Torah koil Torah choyder loirak boy elafilu bekosle abayis boy who loimed. This is an amazing word that I was going to say in this part of the Sikha. It's not just then by Matan Torah that koil gadol Yosef, Hashem's voice was such a voice that permeated the world. Every Yid, when he's learning Torah now, has that same property. The very beams of his house, the very ceiling of his house is going to testify about him. The Rebbe says in the footnote about, actually it's a little bit later, we think that you need to have recording equipment to be able to record and absorb your words. Says the Rebbe, no. The Chazal say that every single sound that a person makes is absorbed, and not just a voice, but even his actions. And I think they've even found scientifically that it causes, even in solid objects, a wave, not a wave, not energy, but a movement inside the atoms. Any type of voice or whatever. So that is perhaps the idea that it's literally recording our speech and our actions. But the only thing is, we don't have the proper equipment to be able to translate all of this. Yeah. Ooh, I'm reminded of something. Going a little bit off topic. There are ways that they found, and spies have used this, whatever, where they could point a certain type of mic or something at a window and be able to, there's like the vibrations, that's what I was looking for. There's the vibrations that happen in the window from a voice that's going on in the room, and they're able to make out what the words are in the room. So that was glass, but la'asad lavoi, all the vibrations that are recorded in everything around us, both from our speech and our actions, are going to become revealed when Moshiach comes. But now they're concealed because we don't have those type of recording and those type of instruments to be able to translate it. The fact that it's concealed, this is also according to Torah, makes sense. Torah sames. Because there's a difference where you're at. Like it says, Evan Mikir Tizak, the knot of wood that's in your, let's say, floorboards will also proclaim. So here the Rebbe says in the footnote, that pasuk b'pashtus is talking about negative, that the walls will tell about the negative things. So the Rebbe says, we know meruba midah toiva midah paranias. Good is always greater than the bad. If it's even going to tell the bad, for sure, it's going to tell over the good and the Torah that the person learned and the mitzvahs that the person did. Ume'ein gilui zed la'asid yeshna gam ata etzel tzadikim. Tzadikim can pick up those vibrations, those recordings in the solid wood and beams, even now. There was a certain chacham in Golod, and somehow or other he had the makil of Rab Meir. V'hi hoisa melamad zoidas. Das? From a makil? How can a stick teach this chacham das because it was Rab Meir's stick? Voy das kazu shechelik matanoim das lo yidiyah lokach, that the Gemara over there said that they couldn't find the type of insights that this zakin that had the makil was able to figure out. Al mishum sheteros shrab meir chadra gam bedvar magashmim shoyisvivay b'shas limudoy ka'amar leil. V'tayras zu nisvega gam b'makil. V'kasher kibal hazakin as a makil. When that chacham got the makil of Rab Meir, nitvasva b'das b'toyra, because he knew how to interpret, he knew how to take from that makil those vibrations that it received. He is gala lefon of mashahoya behelam b'makil. V'zeu gam atam al kach shahoyu ke'elu shetzivu sheyasu saroinam, to be buried in me'ashulchan or stender aleim lamdu aynosnu aleim mazon lanim. This was stories with the Rabbeim and other tzaddikim that they made their aron where they were buried in from those boards, from the table, from their stender. Why? What's the benefit of taking their stender that they learned on? So he says, "Shekain ha'etz shal ha'shulchan shal ha'amud yoid al limud ha'torah shalahem mishum shenifs b'kol ha'soicha adei limudam." The last question we asked at the beginning of the Sikha was, okay, if for whatever reason this was necessary, then everything in Torah must be a lesson. What's the lesson for us? That was no baskoil, there was no echo, meaning that the voice of Hashem was absorbed in everything by Matan Torah. What's going to be when Mashiach comes? That all the revelations of everything that was absorbed into our tables, our chairs, and everything is going to become revealed. So therefore, it's dependent on what we do now. when we learn Torah, has to make sure that the Torah permeates us at least. The table, the chair, you don't have to worry about. It'll happen automatically. But we have to consciously make sure that our entire being is permeated by us. Ad lechelik hadoimim shaboy. Even though in general the world is divided into doimim, tzemeach, chayim, medaber, but in the person himself there's also parts that are like doimim, tzemeach, and chayim, medaber. Kishem sheklal sabriya nechlekes l'arba sugim. Doimim, tzemeach, chayim, medaber, kach gam ba'adam. Oilam cotton, a miniature world, yesh arba sugim elu. Medaber is the rosh seichel shabadam chulu, and doimim is the akev, or the akev, maise shaboy. His action, that's the level of the doimim. Ha-toira tzricha lachter gam akev, k'moshe nemar al Avram Avinu. Akev asher shama Avram b'koili, so it's explained, why does it use a word like akev? To teach us not just the simple meaning of the word akev, which means since, but to teach us also shagam ha'akev shaloi, ha'akev shaloi chosh Elokus, that Avram Avinu's heel, the lowest part of his body, the most insensitive part of his body, sensed godliness. Valderech me Matan Torah chodar ha'koil sh'aser sadibris gam begashmi mishum shoya koil gadol lo Yosef koil lo agbolus shekein ruchnis v'gashmis hem afachim. Gashmius eines efegus ruchnius v'ruchnius einocha deres begashmius. That's the natural state, how it works without the koil gadol v'lo Yosef of Matan Torah. Dafka koil gadol shulamayla mehagbolus v'ishtalshlus. The barriers of spiritual and physical fall away. Ulefon of gashmius v'ruchnius shavim. Dafka hu yachal lachter gam begashmius, and therefore the physical have this. So the Rebbe, by the way, in footnote 31 says an amazing thing. Didn't we say before that when Moshiach comes, everything that I did, whether good or bad, is going to come out from the wood, from the stone, from everything. But we just now said the only way the spiritual and physical can join is only by a very high level above. What Avedis don't have a connection with a high level. How is there the joining of the physical and the spiritual? So the Rebbe says, because Zelum Azas Elokim. Hashem had to make it fair, so he made that klippus should also happen like this as well, that even the negative will also be absorbed into the physical wood and the physical stone and so on. Al derech zeu gam ba'avodas ha'adam. Koyach zeh, sha'atoyra sha'adam loymit, tachter gam ba'akev, ein mitzad ha'seichel shebetoyra. You need to have something higher than that. Shekein ein kol shayches ben seichel v'doymim. So as deep as I understand, and as great as my understanding of Torah is, that's not going to be enough to reach all the way to my heel. There's no connection between the seichel and my heel. In that seichel, there's Hashem's awesome power. And therefore, Torah, which is Ruchni, can reach even into my heel. The Chazal say, what is the way to prevent forgetting the Torah when it's arucha b'chol ramach evarim? When I'm not just learning it with my head, but if the learning of the Torah permeates my entire body. That's why by Yidden, when we learn Torah, first of all, we don't just read it with our eyes like we're reading a book. We have to speak it out. And more so, our whole body is involved. We make with our hands, we shake back and forth. It's the Torah permeating our entire body. By the Torah permeating our entire body, arucha b'chol ramach evorav, then it's mishtameres. Shekein hi magas ad bechinas l'fnei chisech v'decha sham ein shikha ein kol agbola shememena bo hefsek v'shikha b'lo Yosef. Where does forgetfulness come from? When there's a limitation. When there's a limitation, so after time, I'm going to forget something. Something that's unlimited is not possible for it to stop, and therefore it's not possible for it to be forgotten. This means when you reach all the way to the level, like it says, Ein shicha lefnei chisach v'decha, when you're dealing with Hashem's holy throne, a very high level, there's no forgetfulness. When my Torah learning is permeating my entire being, then it's lefnei chisach v'decha, therefore there's no shicha. וכאשר לימוד התורה הוא באופן כזה שהוא חודר גם בדומים שבאדם, הרי זה ולא יוסף גם בזמן, כנ"ל שאינו שכח. It's not just the baskel, but it's also time, like we said. Time means when time passes, it's just as fresh. He doesn't lose his remembering this. It's not just we learn something. A lot of times, the first time we learn something, we get very excited and impresses us. But what happens after the learning? After the learning, we go back to our normal life. No. The Torah has to grab hold of us that we're working and we're going and we're doing everything by the infusion of what we learned. He's working, he's eating, he's sleeping. Nikar by kol hanagoysav she Yehudi aloi metoidam va'atoidam murgeshes b'chol inyonav gama gashim ad b'chol drachecha da'ehu. Here's again. His mind is connected with his actions. Va'oisem mechelke ba'olam direloi yisbarach. Like Yosef said, it's a really amazing sikha.